questions from the audience here, and if you have them, I just think hold them up. When and how will China address its debt problem? How successful will it be? And what are the implications for the global economy?
Conventional wisdom says that China has a financial problem, a debt problem. 99% of the financial papers will say that. So I have a chapter, 30 pages I have on there. And my point is, debt is not a problem in China. It's actually a good thing, not a bad thing. So how do I turn a concern that everyone has into a good thing? Well, first of all, let me just point out, what is China's debt ratio? That is household, government, corporate debt as a share of GDP. The number is 260%. And it's very high because it used to be 150. So it's gone up 100 percentage points. It's 260% of GDP. Is this good or bad? It's exactly the same as America's. It's the same as England's. If you rank the top 80 countries, it's right in the middle. It's lower than most developed. It's higher than most developing. And then the question then is, what is China? A developing or developed country? And the answer is neither, really. It's something in between. It's exactly, therefore, what I would predict it to be. So it's level is not the issue. What is the issue is it increased so rapidly.
We are sorry to interrupt you, but before we move on to the next point, we noticed that a lot of you are returning viewers who have not subscribed. If you've enjoyed our content, subscribing would mean the world to us. It's a small click for you, but it makes a huge difference for us. Thank you for your support.
So why did it increase so rapidly? Because the analysts say every country where it increased this rapidly over a 10-year period, every one of them has collapsed. Why not China? And I basically argue there's something very different about China that is not true in any of these other countries, but no one realizes it. And it is the role of land prices. Now here in San Francisco, you're very familiar with land prices and property. So if your property prices double over 10 years, you start worrying about whether it's too high, you worry about a bubble, right? So what happened to property prices in China over the last 10 years? They went up 600%. 6-time increase, okay? Now, when the property prices go up sixfold, it affects not only houses, which are new, shopping malls, even roads, because it's the land value. Debt surges, right? And the issue then is this sustainable? Is a crash coming? And the conventional wisdom would say, if some property prices go up 600%, you surely have a crash. And the answer in my book is, you don't have one. Why isn't it? Because there was no private property 10 or 15 years ago. So this surge is going from practically nothing to something which is what you'd expect for Asia. So the question now is, if you go to Beijing, property prices are high. But are they too high? So what is the right comparator? So I use India. Let's compare property prices in India, New Delhi with Beijing, Bombay with Shanghai. Now India per capita incomes are 1/3 China's. Its growth rate over the last 15 years is about half. Conventional wisdom would say that India's property prices today would be somewhat lower than China's. But in fact, they're twice as high. But no one writes about India having a property bubble, but everyone writes about China. So in my book, I point out that this is a country where the debt surge is largely because of the surge in property, and it's a catch-up because it didn't have private property. It's really just bringing it up to what is normal, but no one actually realizes that because it's the only country that has this phenomenon. Every other country has had private property forever. So this is a very unusual situation.
Are you worried about social stability, especially that from an income disparity point of view?
Well, China's Gini coefficient is a measure of inequality.
Right.
So a coefficient of 1 means that one person owns everything. A Gini coefficient of 0 means that everybody's income is exactly equal. So a good number is something like 0.4. When it gets to 0.5 or 6, it gets very high. So China's indicator of inequality, when it started off under Deng, it was like 0.25, very low. Social economy, very equal. It soared to 0.45, close to 0.5, became very unequal. Very much like Latin America numbers, very unequal. But it is exactly the same as America's, by the way. It's the same as Singapore's, it's the same as Malaysia. That's not unusual. What is unusual in China is the distribution of wealth is very unequal. The ownership of assets and the people who have property. But even that is a bit strange because the people who are billionaires are those who have somehow got into property. Somewhat that's true in the United States, but not so much. The United States, I think, is the internet. It's the e-commerce. That's where the real wealth is. In China, it's the property. But the interesting thing in China about property and that kind of wealth, unlike America, is that 90, maybe 95% of the Chinese own their homes. Okay? And that's because in the late 90s, the state gave the rights to the homes to everybody, whether you're in a rural or urban area. You could buy your property from the state for a fairly nominal amount. So you have a very interesting situation in China. A very large number of what I call average people have a built-up equity that Americans don't have, unless you were lucky now in the U.S. to have owned a home. They do. So there's a wealth build-up that's just pretty broad, but there's also a concentration of wealth built up from those who happen to have a much greater access to property.
Thank you so much for making it this far. Now we will go to why he is doing what he is doing.
You know, when I was living in Beijing, working for the World Bank for 7 years, and then I continued to live there since I have an apartment, came back to Washington, semi-retired, joined Carnegie, and Carnegie even wanted me to write about China. And I said, well, I'm not sure. I never wrote for the public. And I started reading what people talked about, what they were writing about in Washington. And the first thing that struck me, Bruce, was what people in Washington were worrying about, I didn't worry about at all in China. And what I worried about in China, people in Washington didn't worry about. And that made me wonder, how come? Why is that? Location obviously matters. But when I got into it and thought about it, and I'm an economist by training, I used to teach economics. I've traveled throughout China, every single province in China for many weeks. I said to myself, there's a lot that people are right that's actually just basically wrong. Okay? And at first I thought it was a Western problem, a problem in Washington, a problem in New York or London. Frankly, when I got into it further and further, I realized I had a problem. I had gotten it wrong. I was working under a framework that was very Beijing-centric, very World Bank-centric. So that's the title of my book. Conventional economic wisdom is always wrong. And the question is, who is conventional? It could be the general public. It could be economists and financial people working in China. It could be Chinese specialists. It could be Western policymakers. It can be Chinese policymakers. So in my 10 chapters, I cover topics where each of these audiences, the people who have a vision of China, are basically wrong. And I start off with public perceptions. There are two fundamental questions that I start off with. Pew and Gallup survey Americans every year for 20 years. The question is, who is the world's leading economic power? Okay? 15 years ago, 70% of Americans would say we are. Only 10% would say China. Today, 70% of Americans say China is. Okay? Very few people think America is. 30% think America is. Now, if you ask the same question to the Chinese, who is the world's leading economic power? They will overwhelmingly say America is. So who's right? Who's wrong? And this is ironic, because usually you try to boast about yourself, not about the others. And the Chinese are right. America is the leading economic power. But why do Americans not realize this? Now, if you go back 15 years, same time period, the question is slightly different. Essentially, do you like or dislike China? Are you unfavorable or favorably disposed to China? It's hard to imagine, but 15 years ago, overwhelmingly, American views of China was positive. And today it's quite negative. Even 5 or 6, 7 years ago, it was quite positive. But I'm sure everyone in the audience today, anyone who knows China fairly well, would actually find it kind of hard to imagine that views were so strongly positive, okay? And my book is basically say why. Because much of these views are wrong. And why are they wrong? Because there are economic factors shaping these views which are totally misunderstood. So I begin with public perceptions, and then I go on to technical issues, debt, trade, foreign investment, corruption, political liberalization, foreign policies. And here's what people think. Western views, American views, very important point, it's always wrong. And if it's wrong, The policy recommendations are wrong. No wonder the U.S.-China foreign policy dialogue is so messed up. You begin with the wrong perceptions, you're going to have the wrong policy recommendations.
What do you guys think? Do guys think he is right about the Chinese economy? Or is he downplaying the severity? Please leave your comment below. We would love to hear from you.
Thank you for making it this far. If you like this video, you might want to share it with a like-minded friend. Thank you, and as always, stay blessed.